So diving into the idea of respect in parenting. Huh. Pretty interesting stuff. We're doing a deep dive into this podcast called Never Disrespect Your Child. And man, some of the things they talked about really made me stop and think. It turns out a lot of us might be accidentally disrespecting our kids, even when we think we're doing everything right.
Yeah, it is kind of wild, isn't it? Respect seems so simple at first, but when you get into the whole parent-child thing, it gets, well, a little more complicated.
Oh, absolutely. Like I always thought yelling, that was obviously disrespectful.
Yeah.
And of course the podcast mentioned that. But then they got into these other things like making fun of a kid's mistakes or always comparing them to like their siblings or friends.
Right, and those kinds of subtle things can be even worse because they often go unnoticed. We might not
Yeah.
even realize we're doing it, but it can really mess with a kid's self-esteem.
Makes you wonder, what other things are we doing that we don't even realize?
Well, the podcast really emphasized how disrespect isn't just about the words. Like, your tone of voice and even just like body language can be just as bad. Like rolling your eyes or using a sarcastic tone, even if the words are technically okay.
That's so true. Like even as adults, we know how much it hurts when someone's tone makes you feel like you're being dumb or overreacting.
Exactly. And kids are way more sensitive to that kind of stuff because they're still figuring out all those social cues.
It really shows you how much power we have as parents, right? Our words and even just our actions can have a huge impact. So this whole thing about small acts of disrespect having a big impact, it's not just about like hurt feelings in the moment,
Oh,
right?
no, not at all. The psychological consequences of being disrespected over and over again can be really serious. If a child is always made to feel like they're not good enough, their opinions don't matter, or their feelings are stupid.
They start to believe it. It makes me think about my own childhood and some of the things I was insecure about growing up. I wonder how much of that came from how people talked to me.
That's a good question to ask yourself. And it actually leads to another interesting point from the podcast. It talked about how these patterns of disrespect can get passed down through families. Like, parents who were disrespected as kids might do the same things to their own kids without even realizing it.
It's like a cycle we need to break out of. But where do you even start? The podcast said it's usually not about parents being mean on purpose.
You're right. It's way more complicated than that. The podcast mentioned how stress can play a big role. Parents are human, we get overwhelmed, and sometimes, unfortunately, our kids get the brunt of our frustration.
It sounds like a survival mechanism.
You could say that. Like, we fall back on familiar behavior when we're stressed. But the important thing is to recognize those patterns and find healthier ways to deal with stress.
The podcast also talked about how cultural norms can play a role too, right? Some cultures have parenting styles that are more common, even if they use harsher discipline methods.
That's a really important point. It's not about judging different cultures, but about recognizing that there are different ways to parent, and some are more respectful than others.
It's finding that balance between setting boundaries and still being respectful. It's funny, the podcast really made me question what I thought discipline even meant.
Oh, how so?
Well, I used to think being respectful meant letting them do whatever they wanted. Like,
Yeah.
if I'm being respectful, I can't tell them no or set limits.
I think a lot of people have that misconception, and the podcast does a good job of explaining why that's wrong. It says you can be firm and respectful at the same time. True respect means setting boundaries, but doing it in a way that recognizes the child's feelings and dignity.
That makes a lot of sense.
Hmm.
So we've established that disrespect, even the little things,
Yeah.
can have a real impact on kids. And we've talked about why parents might fall into these patterns. It all feels a bit heavy, doesn't it?
It can, yeah. But the good news is the podcast doesn't just leave us with all these problems. It gives some really practical advice for becoming more respectful parents.
That's what I was hoping for. It's one thing to know what not to do, but changing our behavior is way harder.
Absolutely. And that's where the podcast really stands out, in my opinion. It gives you a roadmap for parents who are ready to make those changes.
Okay, so let's talk about that roadmap. Where do we even start? What are some of the main things about respectful parenting?
One of the most basic things, and probably the hardest to actually do, is just listening.
Listening. I do that all the time. My kid never stops talking.
I hear you. But the podcast is talking about listening on a deeper level. Not just hearing the words, but really paying attention, looking them in the eye, and repeating back what they're saying to make sure you understand.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I could definitely improve on that. It's so easy to get distracted or try to solve their problems before I even really understand what's going on with them.
It happens to everyone, and it takes practice, especially when things are heated and we're feeling all those emotions ourselves.
So it's about being present, both physically and mentally. It's about making our child feel like they're being heard and understood. That makes me think of something else the podcast talked about. Validating feelings. I got to admit, that's one I struggle with.
It's hard for a lot of parents. It can feel weird to validate feelings that seem irrational or overblown to us.
Exactly. Like, my kid might have a total meltdown because we're out of their favorite cereal, and I just want to say, it's just cereal, get over it. But the podcast suggests something different, right?
It does. It says that validating feelings doesn't mean you agree with them. It's about acknowledging how strong the emotion is, even if the situation itself seems small to us.
So instead of telling them their feelings are wrong, I might say something like, I can see that you're really upset about the cereal. It's disappointing when we don't have what we want.
Exactly. And that simple acknowledgement can make a huge difference. It helps your child feel seen and understood. It teaches them that their feelings are okay, even if their behavior needs to be addressed.
Okay, so we've got listening and validating feelings. I'm starting to see how these little changes can actually be really powerful.
They are, and they set the stage for a more respectful and connected relationship with your child.
This is giving me so much to think about. What else can we add to our respectful parenting toolkit?
The podcast talked about speaking kindly, even when we're setting limits or telling them we don't like something they did.
Okay, so no more yelling, because I said so, at the top of my lungs. I'll admit I've done that a few times.
We've all been there, but the podcast encourages us to find a calmer, more respectful way to communicate, like using I statements instead of blaming them, explaining our reasons, and giving them other options.
It's about showing them the kind of communication we want from them. I could see how that would be more effective in the long run. So we've got listening, validating feelings, and speaking kindly. This is starting to paint a picture of a very different way of parenting than what I'm used to. What else should we add to this picture?
The podcast suggests something that might surprise some people: apologizing.
Wait, apologizing to our kids, like when we mess up.
Exactly. Now, this doesn't mean we have to apologize for every little thing.
Right, like I'm sorry you didn't get the toy you wanted.
No, not like that. But it's about owning up to our mistakes when we make them. Showing children that adults aren't perfect and that it's okay to admit when we're wrong.
I never thought about it that way, but I can see how that would be a powerful lesson for kids. It's about showing them accountability and humility.
Precisely. It teaches them that it's okay to make mistakes, as long as we learn from them and try to do better next time.
Wow, this is really making me rethink some of my own ideas about parenting.
That's the great thing about these deep dives. They challenge us to look at our beliefs and consider new perspectives.
So we've got listening, validating feelings, speaking kindly, and apologizing. I'm feeling like I'm getting a whole new set of parenting tools. What else can we add to it?
The podcast talked about giving children choices whenever possible.
Oh, that's a good one. It's so easy to fall into the trap of because I said so. But I can see how giving them some control, even in small things, could make a difference.
It does. It helps them feel more empowered and in charge of their own lives.
Instead of telling them what to do all the time, we can offer options within reasonable limits.
Exactly. So instead of saying, you have to wear this, you might say, do you want to wear the blue shirt or the red shirt?
It seems so simple, but I bet it can change the whole dynamic.
It can, and it teaches them how to make decisions.
I'm noticing a pattern here. A lot of these strategies are about giving our kids power, letting them have a voice, and treating them with respect. What other empowering things did the podcast suggest?
One that stood out to me was open communication.
I can see how that connects with listening and validating feelings. It's about making a space where they feel safe to express themselves without being judged. But I imagine that can be hard sometimes.
It can. It means we have to put aside our own opinions and really listen with an open mind and heart.
I'm guessing it also means not saying anything sometimes, even when we disagree with what they're saying.
It does. It's about prioritizing their need to be heard over our need to be right.
That's a tough one. But I can see how it would build trust and connection in the long run.
It does, and it sets the foundation for those important conversations that are going to come up as they get older.
This is so insightful. It's really making me rethink how I approach parenting.
That's what these deep dives are all about. They challenge us to question our beliefs and consider new ways of thinking.
Okay, so we've talked about listening, validating feelings, speaking kindly, apologizing, giving choices, and encouraging open communication. Anything else we should add to our growing list of respectful parenting practices?
One last but really important point: avoiding public shaming.
Oh, that's a big one. We've all seen those parents who make a scene when they discipline their kids in public. It's so cringy.
It is. And it can really hurt a child's self-esteem.
It's about protecting their dignity, right?
Exactly. Correcting their behavior is one thing, but doing it in a way that humiliates or embarrasses them is never okay.
That makes sense. A private conversation is much more effective and respectful. So much of what we've talked about today is about changing our perspective, seeing our children as individuals who deserve respect, not just little beings we need to control.
You've got it. It's about recognizing that children are whole people who deserve the same respect we give any adult.
It's a big shift, and it makes me wonder what happens when we as parents start to really live this more respectful way. How does it change the relationship between parent and child?
That's a great question, and it leads us to some of the most inspiring things from the podcast. It talks about how respect can transform not just how we interact with our kids, but also how they develop as people. But that's a topic for another part of our deep dive.
Oh, the suspense. This is already a lot to take in, but I'm definitely excited to hear more.
Yeah, it really does make you think about the long-term effects. You know how we treat kids?
It does. And I'm curious about that. What does the podcast say about how this whole respectful approach actually affects how a kid grows up?
Well, one big thing is that when children feel respected, they're more likely to develop like a strong sense of self-worth.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
I mean, they're not always being told they're wrong or that their opinions are stupid.
Exactly. It creates a good environment, where they feel safe and supported so they can try out their ideas and say what they think and learn from their mistakes without being afraid to be judged.
It sounds like it sets them up for success, not just personally, but also in their relationships and even their careers.
Absolutely. Respect helps build trust and understanding, and those are so important for any healthy relationship.
It makes me wonder if this could be like a key to breaking those cycles of disrespect we talked about before. If children grow up feeling respected, maybe they're less likely to repeat those same harmful patterns in their own lives.
That's a great point. And the podcast actually touches on that. It suggests that respectful parenting can have a ripple effect and create a more positive and caring society overall.
That's a really nice thought. It's like, well, we can actually make the future better, one interaction at a time.
I love that perspective. It reminds me of something the podcast said that stuck with me. It said, the way we treat our children today influences the adults they will become tomorrow.
Wow, that's powerful. It really puts things in perspective. It makes this whole conversation about respect feel even more important.
It does, doesn't it? Because in the end, it's not just about having kids who behave well. It's about raising kind and caring people who feel good about themselves and can make a positive difference in the world.
It's about creating a culture of respect that goes way beyond our own families.
Exactly. And that actually leads to another important point from the podcast. It emphasizes that respectful parenting is a journey, not like a destination.
So it's not about being perfect all the time. Because let's face it, no parent is perfect.
Exactly. It's about trying our best, being aware of how we're interacting with our kids, and being willing to say sorry when we mess up, which we all do.
It's about learning and growing together with our kids.
Yes, and remembering that they're learning and growing too. They're going to push our buttons and test boundaries. That's all part of it.
So it's about handling those challenges with patience and understanding instead of resorting to disrespect.
Exactly. It's about staying connected to our kids even when they're acting in ways that make us mad.
Yeah.
Because those are the times they need our love and support the most.
This is all so helpful, but honestly, it also feels a bit overwhelming. What if I mess up? What if I accidentally fall back into those old patterns of disrespect?
It's totally normal to have those worries, and the podcast talks about that too. It's not about blaming ourselves when we make mistakes. It's about noticing them, apologizing, and trying to do better next time.
It's about progress, not perfection.
Exactly. And I think it's important to remember that we're not alone in this. There are so many resources out there for parents who want to be more respectful, like the podcast we're talking about.
That's a good reminder.
Yeah.
We're all in this together, learning and growing as we go.
And the more we talk about these things, the more normal it becomes for everyone to parent with respect.
I like that. So let's say someone's listening to this and they want to start using these strategies in their own life. What advice would you give them? Where do they start?
I think the first step is looking at yourself. Take some time to think about your own childhood, your own experiences with respect and disrespect, and how that might be affecting how you parent.
So we need to understand our own stuff before we can help our kids with theirs.
Exactly. Once we see our own patterns, we can make better choices about how we want to interact with our children.
It's like that saying, know thyself. It's true for parenting, just like anything else in life.
For sure. And after you've done that inner work, start small. Pick one thing that resonates with you and focus on doing it consistently. Don't try to change everything overnight. It takes time.
And be patient with yourself. It takes a while to break old habits and make new ones.
You got it. And remember, every little step you take towards respectful parenting is a win. It's a gift you're giving not just to your kid, but also to yourself and the world around you.
That's a nice thought. It makes me think about the ripple effect we were talking about before. Even small acts of respect can create a chain reaction of positivity.
Exactly. And if more parents start using these principles, we can change the whole culture to be more respectful and understanding.
I love that vision.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've covered a lot here. We've talked about how respect affects a child's development, the importance of self-awareness and patience, and the power of small changes. I'm feeling pretty inspired, and I hope our listeners are too.
Me too. And I think it's important to point out that this is just the beginning. There's so much more to learn about respectful parenting.
There is.
Yeah.
And that's why we have part 3 of our deep dive, Sue. But before we get to that, I have a question that's been on my mind throughout this whole conversation.
I'm listening. What's the question?
Well, we've talked a lot about respecting our kids. But what about the other side of that? How do we teach our children to be respectful of other people?
That's a great question. And it gets to the heart of what it means to build a truly respectful and caring society. But I think it's time to move on to part 3 of our deep dive, where we'll discuss just that.
Sounds good. Let's dive in.
Right.
All right, so let's dig into this idea of teaching our kids to be respectful of others.
It's such a big part of respectful parenting, and I feel like it doesn't get talked about enough. I mean, we focus so much on how we treat our kids, but we got to give them the tools to be respectful to everyone else too, right?
Makes total sense. We want our kids to be good people,
Yeah.
the kind who make the world a better place.
Exactly. And the podcast really stresses that it all starts with us, with how we act. We have to model that respect.
It's like, do as I say, not as I do. It just doesn't work with kids.
Nope, not at all. Kids are like little sponges. They soak up everything. They watch how we treat other people.
Yeah, if we're always yelling at the cashier or talking bad about the neighbors, our kids are going to see that and think it's okay.
They will. And then they'll probably do the same things. But if they see us treating everyone with kindness, no matter who they are or what they believe,
They'll learn that that's how you're supposed to act.
that's it. And it's more than just being polite. It's about teaching them to appreciate differences, to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard.
It's about raising kids who can understand other people's feelings and see things from their point of view.
Exactly. And the podcast has some great ideas for how to do that. One thing they talked about was having conversations with our kids about respect.
So not just lecturing, but actually talking with them.
Yeah, like asking them questions, really listening to what they think, and getting them to think about how their words and actions impact other people.
It's like we're helping them create a more respectful world.
Really, I like that idea.
Mm.
The podcast also suggested using real-life situations as teaching moments.
Oh, like if you see someone being bullied or someone not being treated fairly.
Yeah, talk to your kid about it. Explain why it was wrong and what they could have done differently.
It's like helping them figure out what's right and wrong and giving them the confidence to stand up for what they believe in.
Absolutely. And it's important to have these conversations even when they're tough, even when we feel uncomfortable.
Yeah, because they're the ones that really help our kids develop their values.
Right. They're the ones that help them figure out how to handle tough situations in real life.
This is all really helpful, but I have to admit it's also a little overwhelming. It's a lot to think about.
I get it. It can feel like a huge responsibility to teach our kids all this. But remember, we don't have to be perfect. We just have to try.
So it's like we were saying before, progress, not perfection.
Exactly. Every little thing we do to teach our kids about respect is a step in the right direction. And those little things add up over time.
It's like planting seeds that will grow into a more beautiful world, full of kindness and compassion.
I love that. And I think that sums up what we've been talking about today. Respectful parenting isn't just about raising kids who behave. It's about planting those seeds of kindness and empathy and fairness that'll hopefully keep growing for generations.
It's about building a legacy of respect that goes way beyond our own families.
And that legacy starts with us, in our homes, in our communities, everywhere. Every time we choose kindness, every time we choose empathy, every time we choose respect, we're adding to that legacy.
It's powerful to think that we can make that kind of difference.
We can. And I think the podcast we've been talking about gives us a really good guide for how to do it. It's given us so much to think about, so many practical things we can try, and so much hope for what's possible when we really commit to respectful parenting.
I couldn't agree more. And to everyone listening, thank you for joining us on this journey. Remember, respectful parenting is a process. It's not about getting everything right all at once. Be kind to yourselves, be patient with your kids, and remember that even small steps make a difference. Because together, we can create a world where respect is just the way things are, not some special exception.
Well said. And that's a wrap on our deep dive into respectful parenting.
Thanks for joining us, everyone. And remember, keep learning and keep growing.